First, thank you, Professor Raghib, for this generous invitation and for your very generous comments. Now, the talk I'm giving tonight is actually what I'm really working on now, as opposed to what I think I said I was working on the religion website, although they're all kind of there. And it's part of a larger study of slaves in the Mamluk Empire, not primarily the slaves that we think of, the white military slaves, but what are sometimes called the domestic slaves, who tended to be, I call slaves of color, and I'm not actually using that term anachronistically. But thank you all for coming and for listening to what I could easily have called the story of Nightingale. I'm beginning not with my own voice, but the voice of a 15th century Hanbali jurist. At one time, I bought a black slave woman, and I named her Nightingale, Bulbul. She was blessed, pious, and a very good character. She bore me my son, Abdul Hadi, and a daughter whom I named Aisha. Then she, Nightingale, died of the plague in the year 83, which is 883, 1478. She was with me for 10 years, and she never left my house, even when my brother was married. Now, it was asked of me that she attend the wedding, but I said, you tell her. She was asked, but she refused adamantly. She would not even listen to the invitation. She, Nightingale, said, I swore that I would never leave this house until my death. Now, there are many unusual anecdotes about her refusal to leave the house, and she never did leave my house. Now, the author of this short anecdote was Yusuf ibn Abdul Hadi, who's more commonly known today as Ibn al-Mibrid. He was a learned Hanbali scholar. He lived out his life in the Salahiyya quarter of Damascus from 1437 to 1503. Now, to avoid confusion, I'm going to refer to him by his commonly used modern name, Ibn al-Mibrid, which is a name that actually he rarely used himself. So I refer to him as Ibn al-Mibrid, or in certain places by his given name, his ism, Yusuf. Now, I think that Ibn al-Mibrid and apparently his slave woman, Nightingale, knew this pious maxim. A woman should only leave the home 3 times: on the day of her marriage, when she leaves her parents' home for the home of her husband, on the day of her parents' funeral, and on the day of her own funeral. A maxim that I should add is more of a pious ideal in the daily life of 15th century Damascus than a social reality. Now, on a very first reading, Nightingale's vow, her refusal to leave Ibn al-Mibrid's house, seems to fit into this pious paradigm, and I think she was trying to fit herself or reconstitute herself within this paradigm. But Nightingale was a slave, not a wife. She entered Yusuf's home not as the result of a social transaction, marriage, to paraphrase Barbara Johansson, but as the result of a commercial transaction, the purchase of a commodity from the slave market. As a slave, Nightingale was deemed to have no parents, but she did indeed leave Ibn al-Mibrid's home on the day of her own funeral. Now, this is the first of 2 anecdotes by Ibn al-Mibrid that constitute the story of Nightingale, the story that is really at the center of this paper. Now, I will come back to the second anecdote, which is a bit more complex, later. But what I hope to do in this talk is to present a kind of case study of how we can recover some of the realities of female slavery in the medieval Middle East, or at least maybe to reflect upon them, despite the limitations of our sources. Nightingale's story, even though it is narrated by her master, gives us a glimpse, I think, into the ways in which, as I said in my title, more or less, one female slave resists certain aspects of her enslavement, and she uses the language of piety to resist. Now, even if she's not, we cannot say that she's really resisting enslavement, I think she is trying to regain some control over her body, the commodity that Ibn al-Mibrid purchased. Now, before I proceed, I want to say a few words about the existing scholarship on female slavery in the medieval Middle East, a scholarship that continues to be limited. And I think that some of those limitations are the product of the ways in which female slaves have been conceptualized in the scholarly literature, the ways their experiences have been conceptualized. The first problem is that the study of female slaves has largely been the study of the men who owned them. Now, this perspective, of course, ignores the fact that women owned female slaves, but Nightingale's owner was a man, Ibn al-Mibrid, and the experience of slave women and girls owned by men was very different from the experience of female slaves owned by other women. Now, the second problem is that female slaves continue to be viewed through the lens of two terms, slave girl and concubine. Now, many modern scholars, as a matter of convention, still refer to female slaves like Nightingale, no matter how old they were, as girls, slave girls. Now, historically, in almost all slaveholding societies, male and female adult slaves are further disempowered by the use of juvenilizing terms. And it's not surprising that one of the most common terms for female slave in medieval Arabic was jaria, girl. Now, if modern scholars were simply translating in a rather unreflective way the language of the sources, this would be problematic enough. But even when the text does not, or the author of the text, like Ibn al-Mibrid, does not use the word jaria, but one of the many other synonyms for slave woman, modern scholars still talk about slave girls. In the very small number of passing references to Nightingale in Western scholarship, she is a girl unto the day of her death, when she finally leaves Ibn al-Mibrid's home as a corpse. Now, the term slave girl, to my mind, is not just juvenilizing. I think it also has some erotic, exotic connotations. Now, in the case of the term concubine, erotic is not a connotation, it's practically a synonym. Concubine conjures up luxury, privilege, success through sex. The concubine is the one who is fortunate enough to find her way into her master's bed. But of course, according to Islamic law, a man has the right of sexual access, with very limited exception, to the bodies of any and all of his female slaves. This is one of the ways that female slaves owned by men are defined differently from male slaves owned by men. The purpose of the male slave is service or labor. The purpose of the female slave is also service or labor and sex, and the production of children. And this is the language of the sources that I'm replicating. So all female slaves owned by men were, so to speak, in their master's beds. And this, I think, has been, once again, citing Barbara Johansson, has been very eloquently demonstrated in terms of the legal discourse in his article on the valorization of the human body in Muslim Sunni law. Now, when it comes to the third legally defined purpose of the female slave, producing children, and in this case we're talking about freeborn legitimate children, the question of terminology becomes perhaps even more complicated. Nightingale gave birth to two of Ibn al-Mibrid's freeborn children, and actually I think the oldest one, the boy Abdul Hadi, is one of the few children of Ibn al-Mibrid to survive to adulthood. So she had the legal status of Walad, the mother of a recognized freeborn legitimate child by her master. She ceased to be alienable property. She would be automatically freed on her master's death, although of course she predeceased him. Now, in the Mamluk period, it was very, very common for men of what we might call the middle and upper classes, whether military, civilian, ulama, to use slave women as reproducers of free, legitimate offspring. I think there were a variety of good practical reasons for this. Nightingale was by no means the only slave woman whom Ibn al-Mibrid bought and named. In fact, most of his 26 children, as I said, very few of whom lived to adulthood, were his children by female slaves. But it was motherhood, not sex, that gave women like Nightingale a chance to improve their status and to regain, to a limited extent, control over their own bodies. Now, I would like to point out that this observation is not by any means unique to me. Leslie Pierce's groundbreaking book on the Ottoman imperial harem, she makes a similar point, long before I did, that it really wasn't sex or love that gave women in the harem authority, but it was producing a son. Producing a child, and of course Nightingale is not in a sultan's harem, she's kind of in an ordinary, prosperous middle-class home. Producing a child made the slave woman inalienable, so it's a bit more control over her body, but it gives her a place in a family network. The brother whose wedding Nightingale refused to attend was the paternal uncle of her children. The bodies of mothers are, of course, constituted very differently from the bodies of slave girls and concubines. So, as I've pointed out, Nightingale was not a girl, at least not when we meet her in Ibn al-Mibrid's narrative, and I do think she resisted. And her body was one of the sites of her resistance, but certainly not in a sexualized way. In fact, I think it was consciously desexualized, radically different from the conventional slave girl concubine narrative. Now, we'll turn to the second anecdote, which is the second half of Nightingale's story, because I think that very much illustrates the point I'm trying to make. And it's a little bit long, but I'm going to read you the translation as opposed to a summation, because I think it's an important text. So, Ibn al-Mibrid speaking again. One of the stories about her, Nightingale, is that she asked me to buy her a silk tunic, it's kind of an overgarment, to wear while she worked. So one day I happened to be in the marketplace, and I saw a man with gray squirrel pelt, Sjab, and I bought it for 88 dirhams. Now, gray squirrel pelt, it was a luxury item. It was imported from Transoxiana in Russia, and it was used either for ornamental trim or a very warm, kind of fancy, expensive lining of garments, usually silk, brocade. So, returning to Ibn al-Mibrid, he says, "But when I brought it to her, Nightingale, she said, 'What is that?' I said, 'What you asked for.' She said, 'Are you not the one who says that Sjab is haram? By God, I won't wear it. Take it back.' Then she, Ibn al-Mibrid tells us, she lowered her eyes, which is probably a wise move. Now, his response to this, as he tells us, is to basically say, cut it out. Let it alone. Stop. He says, sometimes after that, and this is Ibn al-Mibrid again, I found that she had unsewn this fur from its facing. She told me, that the facing is completely empty, meaning the lining has been removed. It's ripped out the fur, so sell this fur. So I took the fur and I sold it for, and there's a lacuna, we don't know how much he actually made from the fur or recouped from his original 88 dirhams, and the facing remained empty. Then 10 days before her death, Nightingale came to me with the facing, the unlined cloth, and she said, I want you to sell this, and from the proceeds, I want you to buy a rattle of flax so that I might spin it with my own hands, so that I might sell it, so that I might use the proceeds to feed the poor, so that they might pray for me. Ibn al-Mibrid says again, cut it out. He says, I will buy it for you. And I don't know if he means the flax or the food for the poor. But she says, no, it can only come from the price of this unlined cloth. But Ibn al-Mibrid says, after 2 days, she became feverish and contracted the plague and died. So I sold it, and I used the proceeds to feed the poor. Then, after her, Nightingale, I bought another one. And I named her Haram because of this, meaning because of the whole haram Sjab incident. She was the mother of my children, Badr ad-Din Hassan and Najm ad-Din Omar, and I never saw anything from her other than good character. Now, there's a great deal going on in this anecdote, I think. Perhaps, undoubtedly, more than Ibn al-Mibrid himself was aware of. Of course, it's the story about the giving and rejecting of the gift, which is a serious thing. And it's about the pointed and I would say outrageous, shocking, challenging that a female slave does of her master's knowledge of jurisprudence when he himself is a well-known Hanbali jurisprudent. It is not just challenging it, she's accusing him of being inconsistent, of going back on what he supposedly taught her. But it's also about commercial transactions, buying and selling. And remember that the first anecdote, the beginning, is about a commercial transaction, the purchase of Nightingale. Now, just very briefly, kind of to go through the transactions, the first transaction in this story is Ibn al-Mibrid's going to the marketplace, seeing the Sjab and purchasing it. It's a far more extravagant gift than what she had asked for. But of course, he brings it home. He does not get the response he anticipated. She rejects it. As I said, she rejects it using a language of piety beyond her refusal to leave the home. This is the language of Islamic law. Ibn al-Mibrid just kind of dismisses her, and he doesn't take the Sjab back. Now, when this domestic incident was taking place, or at least according to Ibn al-Mibrid, the whole discussion of the permissibility of Sjab or Sjab fur and whether or not it was ritually pure was a very fraught and active discussion among the ulama in Cairo and Damascus. Now, Sjab had been around for a very long time. Jais talks about it. It's very, very, as he said, soft and desirable. And prior scholars had addressed this question. But what made things so very urgent right now was that in the Mamluk period, the Sjab had been used to line the robes of honor and to trim the robes of honor of high-ranking emirs and members of the civilian bureaucracy, the scribes. But in the 15th century, the robes of honor for the ulama began to be lined with the Sjab. Now, like I said, this was a source of real anxiety. I mean, everyone probably wanted a robe of honor, but could you actually accept it? And there was no agreement across the schools of law or within the schools of law. In fact, scholars who came down on one side or another, forbidden, permissible, acknowledged that there was a lot of leeway for discussion. Now, we never know, Ibn al-Mibrid never tells us what his own position is on the Sjab. And I am actually trying to find that out by searching through his published legal sources, and increasingly more and more are being published. But somehow Nightingale has picked up on the fact that this is an important controversy. Maybe she has misunderstood him. Maybe he has said, well, my Hanbali position is that it is permissible. But she does challenge him. She basically is saying it is ritually impure. Now, the second transaction is when, Nightingale, who's still determined to get the Sjab out of the house, she takes apart the gift, and she asks him to sell the lining, which he does. This time he does it. Now, the third transaction, which actually kind of subsumes and in some ways denies Nightingale's imagined transactions, which are 4, because the first 2 are real, but the second 2 are imagined. So she asks Ibn al-Mibrid to sell what is left from the gift, turn around the profit to buy the flax. So he's seller and buyer. But then she shifts to the first person. I will spin the flax with my own hands, and then I will sell the linen, and with the proceeds of the linen, I will buy the food, and then I will buy the prayers of the poor. So Nightingale, formerly herself a commodity, is claiming the right to be a buyer and a seller. Now, of course, Ibn al-Mibrid silences her again, and even though he clearly is, a benevolent master who's very attached to her. He's the one who ultimately acts as the buyer or seller, who has, to use this overused word, agency in the matter. Now, I want to make a bit of a shift here and come back to actually what's the actual title of my talk. And I want to clarify what I mean by the term violence of naming. Now, when Nightingale was enslaved, and this is kind of typical of slaves in almost all slaveholding societies, she was stripped of everything that made her a person. Which is why Orlando Patterson used the term slavery as social death. Everything that gave her a context and an identity, history, her own family's topography, etc., and she lost all of her possessions, and perhaps the most significant possession she lost was her name. Of course, when Ibn al-Mibrid buys Nightingale, he gives her a slave name, Nightingale, Bulbul. And it's also a name that's specific to female slaves who were defined as black. Slave names in the Mamluk period were quite literally color-coded. They placed a slave, male or female, into one or the other of what were the two overarching categories for enslaved people, black or white. The slave names of black female slaves tended to be nouns that signified birds, animals, precious stones, flowers, etc., or kind of cute things like naming a slave Sweetie, Hulwa, or Lucky. Ibn al-Mibrid uses both of those names. Now, in order to really get a sense of what it means to be named Nightingale, I thought I might compare the naming of Ibn al-Mibrid with the naming of Nightingale. Now, I should say that I cannot give you Ibn al-Mibrid's full name because it would take up too much time. His full name takes up about 5 lines of a printed text. And, I think most of us know kind of typical elements of the classical Muslim name. Ibn al-Mibrid had them all, plus. The first was his laqab, Jamal ad-Din. The second was his kunya, Abul Mahasan. And the third, his ism, which is kind of central to the comparison. His given name that was given to him by his father was Yusuf, the name of one of the most beloved prophets in the Quran. Now, his nasab that follows is what makes his name so long, because it goes back for 25 generations. And it's star-studded. So many great scholars in that nasab. And it goes back to, or actually begins with Umar ibn al-Khattab, one of the favorite beloved companions of the Prophet, and the second of the rightly guided caliphs. So you really couldn't have a better nasab. And then it's followed by a series of nisbas, or relative adjectives, which in his case, and it was very, I think, typical when you read the biographical entries for ulama in his period, they don't just identify him by his school of law, Hanbali, they also identify him by a series of geographical adjectives that give you a geographical history of his family. And one of those nisbas was al-Maqdisi, because he came from this very famous family, probably the most famous family of Hanbali scholars in the medieval Middle East. And they originally came, or at least originally came in the 11th century, supposedly from the environs of Jerusalem. When they were fleeing the Crusaders, they go to Damascus and they found this Salahiyya quarter. Now, I won't give you all of his nisbas because there's too many, but they give you this geographical history, and they also remind you, again, that he's a descendant of Umar, and through Umar, a member of the Prophet's tribe, Banu Quraysh. Now, if we compare this name, which was given to Ibn al-Mibrid in the context of, in a ritual context, the naming, the tasmiyah, which is part of a constellation of ceremonies and celebrations surrounding the birth of a freeborn child, when we compare it to the naming of Nightingale, obviously it's very different. Not only does Nightingale have this kind of non-human name, and I'm going to return to kind of the discussion of names in one of the most famous kind of baby books of the Middle Ages by Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. She also didn't have a nasab. The conventional nasab for slaves was Ibn Abdullah, bint Abdullah, which in this context, even though Abdullah may be a good Muslim name, means the son or daughter of Nemo, the son or daughter of no man. And the nasab ends right there. Now, because Ibn al-Mibrid, oddly enough, because he was very learned, and he, according to his own count, produced 400 books, granted many of them are short tracts, because he was very much under the radar in his own time, he didn't have a lot of students. He only had one famous student, actually. Very much in contrast to his father and grandfather. So one of the sources we do have about his female slaves, and also about his children by his female slaves, are certificates of audition, both in his own manuscripts and in the manuscripts of works by other authors that comprised part of his immense library. Now, as Stefan later points out, the fact that all these sama'at are to the members of his household, once again, and that all these manuscripts, almost all of them are single autograph copies that are now in the, not copies, but single autograph manuscripts now in the Assad Library, once again indicates that he wasn't in a lot of demand. So he had in his slave women and his children, so to speak, a captive audience. And bear in mind that these women by no means understood classical Arabic. We don't know what Nightingale and her fellow female slaves, what their original languages were. They obviously learned some kind of colloquial to communicate, but I can guarantee that they had no idea what Ibn al-Mibrid was reading to them when they all gathered together. And he liked to read on Sunday night, and they listened to these long texts. Now, he probably gave them some kind of gloss, and maybe that's where Nightingale got the idea about the Sjab. But still, I think it must have been a really boring experience. And at one point he tells us that his little infant son, who was also there to get this certificate of audition, fell asleep in the middle of the manuscript. Now, through these certificates of audition, we can see the names of his female slaves are actually the names that he liked to give to female slaves because he recycled them. We actually find out that our Bulbul, she may have been Bulbul number 1, I'm not sure, but she was one of 3 or 4 Bulbuls, Nightingales. His brother had a slave woman named Nightingale. Haram, whose name Ibn al-Mibrid changed to Jewel, Jawhara, was one of probably 3 Jawharas. He also had multiple gazelles. Now, he had only one sweetie, I think, Hulwa, and only one Lucky. Now, Ibn al-Mibrid owned his name, and one of the things that Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, in his handbook for expectant fathers about babies, one of the things he says about naming is that it must be taken seriously, for on the day of judgment you will be called by your own names and your father's names. So you're not just giving the child a name for its life, you're giving the child a name literally until the end of time. And also, he says that names shape character, and that's why you have to be really careful about the name you choose. All of the examples he gives are from the time of the Prophet, when people had ugly, idolatrous names, and the Prophet said, change them, I give you this name, and when they refused, something very bad happened, either to them or sometimes also to their descendants. Now, the good names are obvious: name of the Prophet, the names of the preceding prophets, the names of the Prophet's companions, and also all those Abd names, whether Abdullah or the other names taken from the 99 beautiful names of God, that don't represent a historical personage, but represent the Muslim in correct relationship to his God, the one God. Now, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, as I said, makes clear that there really are tremendous consequences to the choice of a name and to getting the name right, to giving your child, and he's talking about male children, but he kind of generally says periodically, well, the same principles apply to daughters, although obviously it's a different pool of names, but giving your child the right name. Now, when we come to Nightingale and her fellow slaves and other slaves like her, and of course there are comparable pools of names for male slaves, their names are clearly unstable. Names can be changed at will as they pass around from one owner to another. And even though obviously this was not a pet-owning society, and certainly nobody owned dogs, it is kind of like being a puppy dog. You know, it's passed around and it's named and renamed. And a master could change the name that he'd given his slave to another name. So the names of the freeborn people, the freeborn children, they were really open texts that placed these children within the social, moral, and historical and eschatological context of the Muslim Ummah. As I've said, these are stabilizing names. They're permanent names. The examples that Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya gives of when it is okay to change a name are all, as I said, examples of the Prophet changing names or bad names. Now, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya never even conceives of the possibility of naming a child Jewel or Nightingale, or the male equivalent of Jewel or Ruby. It's completely outside of his discourse because these aren't human names. They're not Muslim names. And just to repeat my point, the slave is not named at 7 days or at birth. He comes into the Dar al-Islam in some ways like an infant, naked, kind of tabula rasa. But unlike the infant, he doesn't acquire an identity or a stable identity. He's not named by a father. She's not named by a father in the case of Nightingale. It's not within a ritual context. And as I keep repeating, not Muslim human names. And once again, going back to the elements of the name, the nisbas of slaves, and we don't know Nightingale's nisbas because they're usually these kind of jins markers, these marks of ethnicity that are within this category of black and white. Black slave women might be Habashiyya, Zanjiyya, Takruriya, indicating proposed origin in some part of sub-Saharan Africa, but he just calls her an Amma, which at this point means black slave. If she had an additional nisba, it would be taken from his name, or sometimes from the name of a prior owner. And it's often identified at manumission. Actually, it's a nisba taken from some component of the name of the manumitter. So, as opposed to being this open text in which you could read a slave's history, including the geographical history of the family, this was, in a way, no kind of text at all, because being named as a slave was really being nameless. Now, I hope that I have explained why I called this paper The Violence of Naming, because, and I don't want to really belabor the point, but I do think this naming of slaves was in many ways a replication or an extension of the violence of enslavement. And let's never forget that even when scholars talk about an organized slave trade or parents selling their children, enslavement is always a violent act. And I also chose the title precisely because of the way Ibn al-Mabrid casually uses this formula in the text. I bought her and I named her. But I want to return now to the other part of my title, the part about resistance. And I mentioned earlier that I do think Nightingale uses the language of piety as a kind of resistance, as a way of kind of making her body a site of resistance. And I'll try and explain how I read the two anecdotes, perhaps overread them, some people might say. In the first anecdote, when she says, and his brother actually lived next door, it was Ahmed, his favorite brother, she says, "I will not leave the home." And she could have left fully covered. Virtuous women did this all the time, and it was a very short distance. I think she is actually reclaiming the body that was commonly in the case of female slaves, whether in the actual marketplace or in some other venue of purchase, that was poked and prodded and handled and manipulated in the most intimate ways. And remember, the zones of shame for a female slave are different from those of the zones of shame for a free woman. And actually, when you look at the descriptions in slave buying manuals, there's a very kind of important one by a contemporary of Ibn al-Mibrid's, al-Amshati, who, like Ibn al-Mibrid, was a scholar of medicine. What they propose, and even these men who are religious scholars, actually goes beyond the kind of exploration or violation that should be allowed by the rather limited boundaries of the zones of shame of a female slave. So when she says, "I will not leave the home," this may be kind of an obvious point, she's veiling herself. And I don't mean veiling in the sense of what she wears, although that comes up later. She's creating a hijab with the walls of Ibn al-Mibrid's house. And she's also choosing, because she's invited by family members, and he clearly, he's throwing up his hands and saying, "You ask her." He's not preventing her from going, but she's choosing. She says, "I made a vow when I entered the house," and she entered as a slave, and she very likely died as a slave. We don't know if he manumitted her. That I would never leave this house. As he says, she doesn't. And he even says, they're kind of strange stories about her reasons for not leaving the house. So she uses this very pronounced, even though she's not going out in public, a public language of piety within her own domestic circle. She makes her pious voice, very loud, so everyone will hear it. Now, then we get to the second anecdote, which I think is, as I said, a bit more complicated. Once again, back to Nightingale as the commodity. And as I said, the anecdote has a lot to do with selling and buying, but it's very much about what Nightingale will and will not wear, what she chooses not to wear, what she chooses not to put on her body. She maintains that according to what Ibn al-Mibrid taught her, and I should say that Ibn al-Mibrid's pious fans who were churning out these very fast editions of his legal texts and who have transformed him into something that I think he would recognize, have also transformed Nightingale into a wife, and with no acknowledgement of her slave past. And again, they mention him reading these manuscripts to his household, the slaves who have become wives, and the importance, of course, this is a practice of the pious Salaf. You gather your household together and you teach them. So she says, "You taught me this, you said it." Now, whatever he may have thought about the purity or impurity of Sjab, she's saying it's impure. She's setting herself up as a religious authority, and she won't pollute her body. She won't even pollute her body with what's left of the Sjab gift, the face, after the offending fur has been ripped out. Now, she tries very hard to get the entire gift, the fur and probably what was the silk facing, out of the house before her death. And she doesn't succeed. She does get the fur out, but the facing that she refused to wear, she tries to get that out and, as I said, make it part or an element in this complex chain of transactions that would not only get the fur out, but make her a buyer and a seller. That doesn't succeed. She dies before Ibn al-Mibrid sells the facing, it's possible that he just didn't have a chance to allow her to go through these transactions, but I think given his response, he just chose not to. I mean, he could have said yes, and she happened to die. But that's not what happens. Just as interestingly enough, going back to the whole issue of ritual purity, he doesn't say to us, when she says it's haram, get rid of it, he doesn't say, well, actually, she misunderstood something. This is my position as a Hanbali scholar. Now, it's one of my graduate students in my current seminar pointed this out to me and said, why doesn't he, in a sense, defend himself? And maybe it's because he assumed that his Hanbali readers might know that he had adopted the position of permissibility, or because the wearing of Sjab by a woman was not really the same importance as the wearing of Sjab in a robe of honor by a religious scholar. And of course, I guess the easy reading is that he thought it was sweet in a way. It was a sign of her piety that even if she misunderstood him, she'd just get rid of the Sjab, which is why he gives the replacement, the next slave girl he buys, this unfortunate name Haram, which he changes. So I would argue that Nightingale, Bulbul, in a sense, once again, is, we could say, reclaiming the purity of her body. That she's defining it in some ways. I mean, your body never stays pure all the time, all kinds of things that you require ablutions. But in an almost a moral sense, she's constituting her body as pure by refusing to wear what she says is the polluting Sjab. Now, we know only a little about Nightingale. We have these two anecdotes, which are in Ibn al-Mabrid's voice, and because his manuscripts are in the Assad library, and of course due to the tragedy in Syria, no one has access to that library, I'm using the very small number of sama'at that we have in the manuscript collection at Firestone Library, and also two that were quoted in a 1943 introduction to one of his works, and one that's translated by Yehoshua Frankel, but he doesn't actually give the text. And none of these sama'at refer to our Nightingale. They're all after her death. They're I think one or two other Nightingales. So at the moment, this is what we have. Now maybe, and I hope that when me or someone else gets access to all these other sama'at, we'll have more of the story of Nightingale. I mean, it won't be details, but we'll have a sense of her children and the text she was listening to on these Sunday nights, and maybe one of them was about, had something to do with the legal status of fur. Now, in terms of not having her voice, we really don't, as a general rule, have the voices of enslaved people. And we have the illusion in the Mamluk period that we have these pronounced voices of the male military slaves who constitute the political elite. And just the ones we actually hear about or know about in the sources are the ones that were very successful. They were manumitted, they were amirs, officers, and they kind of rose to the top, sometimes to the very top as sultan. But their voices are through the lens of the ulama, for the most part, as Ulrich Harman, the late Ulrich Harman, pointed out more than once. Occasionally they're through their sons, who as the sons of Mamluks or the sons of emirs have a somewhat different perspective from the ulama. But we still really don't get their voices. But at least the voices that are presented to us by the narrators are much louder and more frequent than the voices of slave women like Nightingale, and generally of slaves of color, including male slaves. Now, I think her story is in some ways a sad story because she never gets Sjab completely, the Sjab present completely out of the house, and that's a very important statement for her. But at the same time, once again in the second anecdote, she makes her voice very loud. and even more so than when she refuses to leave the house, because she says, take it back. I swear to God I'll never wear it. So it's a sad story, but it's also a very interesting story of the ways in which, as I said, this one female slave, even if she did not consciously think of this as resistance, and Ibn al-Mibrad clearly did not see it as resistance, or he wouldn't have told us the story, the ways in which she tries to reshape her body or reclaim her body. So I'm very glad that Ibn al-Mibrad added these anecdotes to the end of a 4-folio text, still in manuscript, of an ornithological treatise on the bird, the bulbul, of course, Nightingale. So I think I'll stop here and ask for questions. So let me just add a PS. Sorry. I think one of the telling things about this Sjab story is that these kind of piety-minded men who were churning out these, as I said, hasty publications of Ibn al-Mibrad's legal texts, and I'd say it's very sad that nobody is churning out publications of his extensive texts, or his legal and religious texts, but he wrote extensive texts on other subjects, history, topography. There's one topographical work has been published, and actually a very good edition. Poetry. You know, he actually wrote, I've seen his poetry in the Firestone Library, and it's pretty mediocre, but that was very typical of the ulama. They all wrote poetry, mediocre poetry. He wrote a qasida, going back to the names, that uses wordplay and uses his name and the names of all of his answers, which going back 25 generations to the Caliph Omar, to demonstrate the really good qualities of his family, his lineage. Now, he actually uses the first 3 lines for himself. And then at a certain point, he starts having to jam more than one ancestor into, you know, each verse. So he wrote a lot on medicine, a tremendous amount on medicine. So these things are not being published, sadly. But the introductions to the works that are being published, these religious texts, they follow a certain narrative. We have Nightingale turned into a wife, and the only story we hear, and it's not even actually quoted, is this was his pious wife, and she never left the house for 10 years. And then that's followed by this segue into how he gathered his family together and read these texts to them. Now, this Nightingale has actually made it to the internet. I found her just by chance on a site by a clearly a very religious man who, it's part of a blog where he says, look at this story, kind of one of the pious wives of sheikhs of the past. She never left her house in 10 years, and he said now our Muslim sisters, they want to leave the house all the time, many times during the day, multiple times. Now, not only do these authors of introductions, not only do they transform Nightingale, they make her into a wife, they condense the story, they leave out almost all, with the exception of the editor who actually cites this or quotes this entire story, they all leave out the Sjab story. That is just gone, her challenging of Ibn al-Mibrad. Now back to the editor who actually gave us this story, because I certainly don't have access to it since it's in the Assad Library. Muhammad Abdul Qadir, who I think his edition was in the 1990s. It's very odd. I mean, I'm very glad he gave us the story, but he begins by saying, he had a pious wife named Nightingale. And this is what he says, Hiqaya Latifa, about her. It's a charming story. So, and then he segues right into quoting, I bought a slave woman and I named her. He gives the text, and then he follows up with the same part of the narrative, which is reading the sama'at, or giving the sama'at to the slave woman. So I mean, obviously, I think these introductions are interesting texts in and of themselves. But I do find it telling, and I'm not quite sure why Muhammad Abdul Qadir actually put this anecdote in, although he almost just kind of inserts it without even acknowledging what it's about. I think it's very telling that they do leave out this Sjab story, because they are reconstituting Ibn al-Mibrid into a scholar who only wrote about religion, usul al-fiqh and hadith. It's true, he was apparently a very fine scholar of hadith. They're making him into a kind of modern Salafi saint, which is a problem sometimes because some of the editors have to reproach him or apologize for him. For example, he says in a biographical dictionary he praises a poet who played chess. We have a footnote from one of these editors saying, how could he say this? How can someone who plays chess be saleh, be good? And then there are an awful lot of, long kind of explanations about his Sufism. So, as I said, and this is just kind of my extended, somewhat rambling PS, I think that the texts are in and of themselves interesting. They are a transformation of Ibn al-Mibrid, but they're a very telling transformation of the slave woman Bulbul, who is, and perhaps this would make her happy, because she's not being made into a slave girl or a concubine as she is by the Western scholars, or I should say also the Arabic language scholars. They don't even have to translate Jariya, they just use it without commenting on it. She is reconstituted as a pious wife, and perhaps she wouldn't mind that her voice of resistance is silenced, because she finally is transformed into what she wanted to be. Okay, I will actually stop there and take questions. Yes, Sir Ahmed. Thank you.
So my question is actually really is a tangent, because I kept wondering, why did he write this? And we have volumes of this wonderful personal anecdotes. And did he write about all his bulbuls or just this bulbul?
No, and actually we have volumes of all kinds of things that he wrote, the poetry, the geography, about Sufism, history, and apparently some of his medical treatises, like his long treatise on the plague, which I hope to view a microfilm of in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, he apparently does mention the deaths of his children, and I think of his female slaves as well. And this is where kind of science in the body would be interesting, because I think it's also in the context of his description as a scholar of medicine of the symptoms of the plague and its progress. But no, a long answer to your question. As far as I know, we have all these certificates of audition, but perhaps it's a huge corpus to get through. This is 400 works. I don't think he has anything else like this, sadly. Yes, Professor Sjab.
Yeah, first, I thank you for the talk, and I want to apologize because I'm really speaking from a position of ignorance about this whole period, this whole thing. But what I wanted to ask is this. Both stories, I felt like obviously it could be read as her usage of the language of piety and knowledge to, in fact, in a way, claim herself the status of a free woman by saying, I will stay in the house, and by demonstrating her knowledge of the religion, the way you narrated as claiming about her body and her. So I'm trying to figure out what are the advantages or disadvantages of reading it as claiming herself a status, some sort of free status, as opposed to or distinct from some sort of claiming of body. Am I
No, that's a very good question, and I will respond to the first reading, claiming the status of a free wife, which I did throw in here. That has a very serious problem because she may have been freed prior to his death. I have no reason to believe that he actually freed her and married her, as she's reconstituted in his introductions. They don't give any evidence for it, and I don't, at least with what I have, I don't see it anywhere, and they don't seem to have much more than I do. But still, we don't know. She may not have been, she was certainly an Umweled, which is, upping her status. So I think actually the body reading may be a better one, or a one you can back up better, because even say if she had been freed, even if she had been freed and married by him, she still was of slave origin.
But I'm not asking about the actual status of her as free, but what the effect of making these claims, placing herself as if she was free.
I see. Well, I see what you're saying. And I guess I was talking in a kind of more literal way about the reading itself and whether or not we actually know her status. But I think the advantages are in some ways the ones that I stated. She is really defining herself as beyond virtuous, beyond pious, and in a way that also means that her body is concealed. She never leaves the house in the 10 years that after he buys her. And in this very curious incident of her rejection of the Sjab. So I don't think it necessarily gained her any advantages of status, legal status, or she already had a kind of family status by virtue of giving birth to the 2 children. But I do see it, and this is maybe the vague problem with talking about acts of resistance, is that it gives her the advantage, or she tries to use it to give her the advantage, of changing herself or changing her body from that of this violated female slave whom everyone can look at, who's every man can put his hands on when they're in the process of buying and selling, to this covered, veiled, encircled, as it were, model of piety. So I don't know what that answers it.
I guess the other reason I kept thinking maybe this other avenue of going also maybe useful. I've been totally intrigued by the naming of the second slave, Haram, and I'm thinking, is that a way of trying to make sure that new slave doesn't claim status of as if she's free?
No, I actually don't think so. I think it is his brief memorialization of Nightingale. And it's just, it's a name of his own coinage. Nobody names their slave Haram, and it's such an ill-omened name. Every time somebody said her name, people would say, I better stop what I'm doing. So I think it is he's telling us that this is the way that he memorialized this very pious female slave. And I said he very shortly, and we see this in the certificates of audition, we can identify her by her children, and he names it to Jauhara. He changes the name to Jauhara, one of his many Jauharas. Yes, please.
Hi, I have actually sort of a series of questions.
Sure.
Ibn al-Mabrad, he also wrote one of those pious women anecdotes books. Does he mention any of his slaves in there?
And some people see a connection between the fact that it is an edition of one of these pious women books, that it's in the introduction of the edition of one of these books that Muhammad Abdul Qadir gives us the story. But I actually think there is no connection. He's following the same narrative in some ways. When he puts the story in, he's replicating the narrative of prior editors. And all of these women, they're not slave women. They're certainly not Nightingale. They're women who were companions of the Prophet, or holy women, or most of them, in the past. So no, unfortunately, he does not.
And I'm also wondering, I know there was sort of this trope of encouraging your women folk to spin, potentially to raise money to give to the poor. But I mean, I've only read it, I've only heard reference to it in secondary sources, and I don't know if, in the Arabic sources, there's any differentiation made between women folk who are your wives and women folk who are slaves, and if that is an activity that slave women were encouraged to do, and if there's a difference between you know, if it's supposed to be a good and pious thing for women to spin, and yet he's so dismissive of her desire to do this, if it's sort of only a pious practice if your husband tells you to do it? Does that make sense?
No, I think that, and you know, Joseph Rappaport, this very fine article he has in the Mamluk Studies Review, which is kind of a review of what we know about women in the Mamluk period, he does cite this anecdote and paraphrase it, and of course he doesn't turn her into a wife, obviously. And he and I have a very different interpretation, because for him the anecdote is really about kind of changing consumer tastes between the 14th and 15th centuries. In the 14th centuries, and alas, Professor Rappaport, whom I know well and admire, he uses the word slave girl repeatedly. So in the 14th century, men wanted pretty slave girls with nice voices. They wanted singing girls. By the 15th century, like Ibn al-Mibrid, they're looking for pious slave girls who have domestic skills. Now, I said I have some problems with the argument, but of course, everybody spun. I think most women in a house spun. And it was a very practical act. It wasn't just a pious act, and I'm not sure that all the spinning, and I think that was the work she was doing when she asked for the silk garment, that all that spinning was to give money to the poor. I think it was probably very practical. Provided income for the household. You know, flax goes into linen, which you make clothes with. And in terms of the question of what free women and slave women did in the house, you know, of course they did a lot of the same work. Though I think the burden of work, and you know, in these pre-modern households, there was a huge burden of work on women. The burden of work on a free wife was very much reduced by buying a slave, and that's often said explicitly. So I don't know, does that answer your questions, or I think I missed something?
No, I think I was more just thinking something out loud and that answered it.
Thank you so very much for your talk. So this got me to thinking about another person who, well, at least passed through Mamluk Cairo in the 14th century, and that would be Ibn Battuta. And it struck me, and I haven't looked at the text in a while, but the first time I was reading it, I seem to remember that Ibn Battuta at least twice bought slaves and from either Byzantium or southern Russia, and didn't change their names. In one case, he says, "Here, in this town, I bought a slave named Michael." And in another case, he buys a female slave, and he says her name is Maria. And then, on the other hand, later on, he's in India, and he receives a female slave after a battle. And in fact, her husband tries to ransom her back, and he refuses. And then he gives her a slave name. So I'm wondering, do we have many instances of people refraining from this, this violence of renaming? Or is this an idiosyncratic behavior on the part of Ibn Battuta?
You know, I can say that based, and I think that there were slaves probably, especially if they had kind of monotheistic names, maybe their names weren't changed, but based on what I see, you know, and through documents, and I'm trying to go through as many biographical dictionaries as possible, although women, except for, you know, the famous 12th volume of Sakhawi, are rarely there. I don't see slave women retaining their names. I sometimes see that slave men themselves change their names after they're manumitted to Muslim names. But no, it's a very interesting point. I mean, Ibn Battuta also, you know, he buys slaves along the way and then resells them, which does not mean that he was, you know, particularly heartless, although think of it as a heartless act, but the great scholar As-Samhudi, who wrote one of the most important kind of histories and topographies of Medina, when he first goes to Medina, he tells us, you know, I brought my mother with me, and these Mamluk scholars tended to bring their mothers with them when they went places. And I was very concerned about the fact that she needed a slave woman to help her. And I didn't have the money. And I forget the exact sequence, but his sheikh, his teacher, says somehow about the money will be in your pocket. I may be, completely misquoting this, but the thrust of the story is that he's able to buy the slave. But the sheikh also tells him, you're going to get something better out of this. Like the female slave, he sells her for a profit, and he marries. So going back to the question of the service of female slaves and wives, he makes a profit, and I guess he must have paid something in dowry, and he got a wife. Of course, Asamhudi could not stay married. He divorced over and over again, so that's another interesting part of it. So, because I tried to answer your question and added a few of my own anecdotes, but...
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk and for all these answers, which are really great. So I wanted to go back to this elaborate story of the selling of this Sjab and then the shell of it afterwards in order to spin and make money and to spend it for the poor. And first, I'm very happy for that you mentioned how the editor called it Hikaya Latifa in the PS after your discussion, because I have the feeling that probably Ibn al-Mabrad felt that it was Hikaya Latifa as well, just a cute story of this probably, deluded slave woman who should not be that pious anyway, but she's overdoing it in a manner which makes it almost a Hikaya Latifa that doesn't require him to even justify himself. Her opinion is probably the Salafi editor who's writing this have a similar set of mind about, in that sense. But what is also interesting, and I would like to hear what you think about this, is the idea of her trying to make the final sum of money that she wanted to spend in a charity her own, through first selling a piece of property that she was given as a gift, even if she doesn't like it, and then afterwards working with this money to make something that didn't exist before in order to make it her own. Is this also a method of, or an attempt of claiming a property?
Absolutely, and I kind of, because I was worried about time, probably unnecessarily, I actually shortened that section, and yes, I think, it's these kind of transactions within transactions that make this anecdote particularly interesting. And yes, I do think, and even her shift to the first person, and her, first she's trying to just get it out of the house, and then when he sells the lining, he doesn't tell us what he does with the money. I don't think he gave it to her. And then you said she's got the face, probably it was the silk part. She still doesn't want to wear it, but she wants to use it. And, the series of transactions, which will, it's turning the kind of the silk with its lining ripped out, which still must have been relatively valuable. He's going to buy this certain measure of flax for her. Then she's going to spin it, I think, with her own hands is important. And then she starts to the first person, and she will sell it. And then the linen from the flax will turn into food, which will turn into prayers, because, of course, the last transaction she imagines for herself is that she's going to buy the prayers of the poor with food. It's a common enough practice. So yes, absolutely. I think that, it can certainly be read as her attempting to become, as I said, the seller and the buyer. And, to use that original gift that she hated, to use at least part of it as capital that, that she can transform ultimately into prayers for herself that she herself buys. So, yeah.
So this whole anecdote would have been non-existent if he would have just in the first place bought her what she wanted, right? Do you think?
Absolutely. And it's another point. She just asks for this silk she doesn't want silk with Sjab, she just wants silk. And he comes back and says, and he even says to her, it's what you asked for. She says no. So yes, but I think that Professor Ragab is very right that Ibn al-Mubrad himself sees this as a hikaya latifa. And it's not even so much that he thinks she was over the top, although clearly she was confused and over the top when she challenges his knowledge as a jurisprudent. But I think he sees it, as do the Salafi editors, as in some ways an extension of himself. The result of, and this is what it's supposed to happen, of a pious master educating his female slaves. A pious master has pious slaves, especially the mothers of his children. So yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you very much. I just had a quick clarification question. I was wondering, so in the legal discourse, the jurists are quite a bit obsessed with kind of defining the place of, or at least encouraging the wife to be at home all the time, and the particular way that they construct this argument has to do obviously with the availability of the wife to the husband. And I was wondering if I actually can't recall if there's anything similar in terms of the Jariya. Like, I mean, she obviously also has a certain kind of, I don't know if it's an obligation, but obviously it's a bit different, right? So I was wondering if that had any kind of implication in terms of this story and her wanting to stay at home, so to speak.
Well, that's a good question. And actually this pious maxim is a maxim. I haven't actually, the woman should only leave her home 3 times, and apparently it's also common in Brazil, although it's for her baptism. Let's see, it was common in the past in Brazil. So I don't really think it's part of a legal handbook. It's something that's, and also the woman being encouraged to stay at home is not so that she'll be available, it's that so she'll be unavailable to other men. Also I want to add again that there were some very conservative scholars. Ibn al-Hajj al-Abdari was a good example. He just wants women to never leave the house, to stay in one small room in the house. But most of the jurists, they understood that women would leave the house, and provided they were fully covered. But the distinction between the slave woman and the free woman comes up very clearly in a story that Ibn Taghlib tells us about the time of plague. And as usual, ulama tell the Sultan, get women under control. He says women, first they can't visit tombs, then they can't go out at all. And then he says they went out in the garments of their female slaves. So the trick is to say, you can't, the only women who can go out are those whose heads are uncovered. So of course, they're not going to disguise themselves, and it means that female slaves did cover their heads. But there is that clear distinction about what covering really means. So no, I don't think it's because she should stay at home to be available to Ibn al-Mubrad. I think it's that she's literally saying, I mean, it was just a wedding next door. She's saying, I will not leave.
Yeah. I guess, just to follow up, I guess I'm really struck by how, the maybe a kind of universal category of piety is inflected by the material kind of reality of slavery, or even the category of slavery. So in terms of the expectations or even the obligations of free women to cover, and the very aura is different for right, slaves versus free, and so different. It's just interesting for us to see a slave woman kind of thinking of her piety in those terms. Maybe not surprising, but interesting, I think. And again, to go back to also Professor Ragab's point about her kind of almost trying to own property in order to do this act of charity, that's of course preconditioned by owning property. So again, like that act of piety as far as charity goes is actually it depends on owning property, which is really which is not available to a slave at all to begin with.
Yeah, unless the master can give the slave a permission to kind of handle property, and even in a it's a way of owning it. But this really doesn't come up in the text. And if she were freed, she could have owned property. But, you know, I think that you make a good point that we're seeing her in all this in the context of a slave, and you know, she wants to own this property, which is from the gift he gave her, which she should, you know, perhaps think she should own in the first place. But I should caution you that I know this is an anecdote, and it's a very interesting one, and I've really enjoyed working on it. I would like to actually see it in manuscript form. But in the larger work that I'm currently pursuing on slavery, you know, obviously I don't, you know, I say the scholarship in the field is limited, and I was going to add anecdotal, but I was starting with an anecdote. And, you know, my critique of other scholars who've worked on slavery, and, you know, I also include myself. But we use the anecdotes, but to get beyond them, we have to use as many other kinds of sources as we can. And I think documents are crucial. And we're finding more and more of those, the documents of sale, court documents relating to slaves. Nothing like the Ottomanists have. And I also think these sama'ats will be good. But it's not, I mean, anecdotes are good, and sometimes it's all we have. But you know, I think we need something more than anecdotes. So thank you all. This has really been an incredibly, you know, helpful discussion.